A blistering explosion tore through the battlefield, the air thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. Captain Elias Mercer sprinted across the chaos, his breath coming in ragged gasps as screams and gunfire erupted around him. He wasn't thinking about survival. His eyes were fixed on the small figure cowering beneath a collapsed structure, her pale violet skin stark against the debris. She wasn't human, and that fact alone should have stopped him. But it didn't. Without hesitation, Elias leaped over rubble and reached her side, his hand outstretched. "Come on!" he shouted over the roar of combat, his voice hoarse but commanding. The girl looked up, her wide, luminous eyes filled with terror. She hesitated, her slender fingers clutching a small, ornate device close to her chest. Behind her, the structure groaned ominously, threatening to collapse further. Elias didn't wait. He grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. "If you stay here, you're dead!" A massive beam tore loose, crashing down where she had been moments before. Elias pulled her with him, weaving through the chaos, shielding her, with his own body as debris and stray energy bolts rained around them. His chest burned with exertion, but he didn't stop until they reached a dilapidated shelter on the outskirts of the battlefield. "Stay here," he ordered, panting as he crouched in front of her. "Don't move until it's clear." She clutched his sleeve, her voice trembling. Why are you helping me?" Elias paused, caught off guard by the question. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple metal charm shaped like a star. He pressed it into her hand, his expression softening despite the chaos outside. "Because sometimes, doing the right thing is all that matters," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil. "Hold on to this. It'll keep you safe." Before she could respond, he was gone, disappearing back into the fray. Years later, Elias stood in the dim light of his cluttered workshop, the hum of machinery and the occasional spark of welding filling the air. His life was quieter now, far removed. From the war that had left scars both visible and unseen, he preferred it that way. The chime above the door startled him. Visitors were rare, and customers even rarer in this backwater corner of the galaxy. Wiping his hands on a rag, he turned toward the entrance, his brows furrowing at the sight before him. She stood there, an aura of elegance clashing with the rustic surroundings. Her dark hair cascaded in soft waves, framing a face that seemed both otherworldly and impossibly familiar. Her eyes, a deep violet, locked onto his with an intensity that made his heart skip. "Elias Mercer," she said, her voice smooth yet commanding. "Depends on who's asking," Elias replied cautiously, crossing his arms. She stepped closer, and he caught a glimpse of the faint markings along her temples, a sign of her alien heritage. His mind raced, fragments of memory surfacing. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, a small smile playing on her lips. Elias shook his head, though a gnawing sense of recognition tugged at him. "Should I?" She extended her hand, revealing a small metal charm, tarnished but intact, the same star-shaped token he had given years ago. Elias stared, his breath hitching. "No way!" "It's you," she confirmed, her smile widening. "The human who saved my life." Elias ran a hand through his hair, leaning against the workbench, as the weight of the moment hit him. "You survived. Thanks to you," she said, stepping closer. Her expression softened. "And I've been looking for you ever since." Elias chuckled dryly, though it lacked humor. "I'm not exactly hard to find. Just a washed-up mechanic trying to keep out of trouble." Her gaze didn't waver. "You're more than that, Elias. To me, you're a hero." The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Finally, he gestured toward the workshop. "Well, you found me. What now?" She hesitated, as if weighing her next words carefully. "I came to thank you, and to repay my debt." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Debt? You don't owe me anything." "I disagree," she said firmly. "In my culture, a life saved is a bond that cannot be broken." Before Elias could argue, the workshop door swung open again, and a burly man stepped inside, his expression dark. "What's this alien doing here?" The air grew tense. Elias glanced at Serena, noticing how she straightened, her regal demeanor unshaken. "She's my guest," Elias said, his tone sharp. "Guest?" the man scoffed. "After what her kind did to us during the war." Elias stepped forward, placing himself between Serena and the newcomer. "That war's over. Let it go." The man glared, but eventually stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. Serena watched him leave, her expression unreadable. Elias sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's complicated. People lost a lot, but not everyone blames your kind." She nodded, though her shoulders sagged slightly. "I suppose I have much to learn about your people." Elias smirked, gesturing toward the mess of tools and parts around them. "Then you're in luck. This is the perfect place to start." Serena smiled, the tension easing. "I'll take you up on that." As she stepped further into the workshop, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life was about to get a lot more complicated. And strangely, he didn't mind. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments neither Elias nor Serena had expected. She was stubborn in her determination to help around the workshop, despite her obvious lack of experience with anything mechanical. Elias leaned against the workbench, arms crossed as he watched her fumble with a wrench, her brows furrowed in concentration. "You know, Princess, you don't have to prove anything. I can manage just fine without you dismantling half the tools." She shot him a glare, her expression equal parts defiant and amused. "First, stop calling me Princess. It's Serena. Second, I am perfectly capable of contributing. Just give me a moment to figure this out." "Fair enough, Serena," Elias said, emphasizing her name with a playful grin. "But if you strip the bolt on that coupler, I'm billing you for the replacement." She glanced at the part in her hand, her cheeks flushing faintly as she realized she was indeed turning the wrench the wrong way. Carefully, she adjusted her grip and managed to loosen the piece without further incident. "There," she said triumphantly, holding up the coupler like a trophy. "See? Not entirely useless." Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "You might want to aim a little higher than not entirely useless." Their banter carried on throughout the day, with Serena's natural curiosity, sparking an endless stream of questions about human tools, technology, and culture. Elias found himself both amused and impressed by her willingness to dive into the unfamiliar, though her attempts often ended in minor disasters. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon of the small outpost planet, Serena had managed to leave a trail of scattered tools, grease-streaked surfaces, and one very amused human in her wake. "You're a natural at making a mess," Elias teased, as he handed her a rag to wipe her hands. She accepted it with a huff. "And you're a natural at underestimating me." The spark in her eyes made him grin despite himself. For someone who had likely spent her life surrounded by formality and deference, she was surprisingly easy to talk to. As they cleaned up, Elias couldn't help but ask, "So, why me? Why come all the way out here when you could have sent a thank you card or something?" Her hands paused mid-wipe, and she looked at him, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "Because what you did wasn't just an act of kindness. You risked everything for someone you didn't even know. I've spent years trying to understand why." Elias shrugged, leaning against the workbench. "Does there have to be a reason? You were just a kid. I couldn't stand by and let you die." "But it wasn't your fight," she pressed, her voice soft. "You could have walked away, and no one would have blamed you." Elias rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze dropping to the floor. Maybe I didn't want to be the kind of person who could walk away. The weight of his words hung between them, unspoken emotions threading through the silence. Serena studied him for a moment before offering a small, understanding smile. "You're a rare kind of person, Elias Mercer," she said. He snorted, the tension breaking. "Yeah, well, don't let it go to your head. I'm also the kind of person who will charge you for breaking my equipment." She laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to light up the dim workshop. "I'll try to keep that in mind." Their conversation was cut short by a sharp knock at the door. Elias frowned, setting down the rag and motioning for Serena to stay back. He opened the door cautiously, revealing a wiry man with a patchy beard and shifty eyes. "Mercer," the man said, his tone low. "We need to talk." Elias stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "What's this about, Riker?" The man glanced around nervously before leaning in. "Word's out about your guest. Folks aren't happy. You might want to think twice about letting her hang around." Elias's jaw tightened. "She's not bothering anyone. Tell them to mind their own business." "That's not how this works," Riker said, his voice dropping further. "She's royalty from the Empire that nearly wiped us out. People don't forget that kind of thing." "And I don't forget who helped me on the front lines," Elias shot back, his tone icy. "She stays." Riker raised his hands in mock surrender. "Your call, Mercer. Just don't say I didn't warn you." As the man disappeared into the shadows, Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment, his mind churning. When he finally turned back inside, Serena was waiting, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Trouble?" she asked. "Nothing." "I can't handle," Elias said, though the set of his jaw betrayed his unease. Serena stepped closer, her gaze steady. "If I'm putting you in danger, I can leave." Elias shook his head. "Not happening. You've got as much right to be here as anyone else. Besides, I don't scare easy." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Neither do I." For a moment their eyes met, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Despite their differences, worlds, even galaxies apart, they were bound by something neither could fully explain. "Let's get some rest," Elias said, breaking the silence. "Tomorrow's probably going to be interesting." Serena nodded, though. The small smile lingered as she followed him toward the back of the workshop. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wasn't facing them alone. Morning came too quickly for Elias, though the sharp metallic knock at his workshop door jolted him awake faster than any alarm could have. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he moved to answer it, muttering under his breath about people who couldn't let him have a quiet life. The door swung open to reveal two figures dressed in uniforms that screamed authority, their faces set in identical masks of disapproval. Behind them, a sleek transport hummed, its polished surface reflecting the early sunlight. "Elias Mercer?" the taller one asked, his tone clipped and official. "Yeah. What's it to you?" Elias replied, crossing his arms and leaning casually against the doorframe. The shorter figure stepped forward, glancing over Elias's shoulder into the workshop. "We have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive of the Octaran Empire." Elias's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression neutral. "Fugitive? That's a strong word for a visitor." The taller man's eyes narrowed. "We're not here to debate semantics. Turn her over, and we'll leave you in peace." "Funny," Elias said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I didn't realize peace came with threats." Before either officer could respond, Serena appeared at Elias's side, her chin held high and her gaze unwavering. Her presence was commanding, her royal lineage evident in the way she carried herself. "I suggest you lower your tone when addressing him," she said, her voice steady and regal. "Elias Mercer is under my protection." The officers exchanged a glance, clearly taken aback by her audacity. "With respect, Your Highness," the shorter one said carefully, You have no authority here. The Empire has fallen. You're no longer royalty. Serena stepped forward, her proximity forcing the man to take a half step back. Authority is not given. It is earned. And if you think I've come this far to let bullies dictate my fate, you're sorely mistaken. Elias bit back a grin, watching the officers squirm under Serena's unrelenting stare. It was impressive, really, how she managed to exude power despite the dirt-streaked coveralls she'd borrowed from his workshop. The taller officer cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. We have orders to bring you in. Your Highness, you can come willingly, or we can... You can what? Elias cut in, stepping protectively in front of Serena. His voice was calm but dangerous, a tone honed through years of war. Take her by force? Not on my watch. The tension was palpable, the air crackling with the promise of violence. For a moment, no one moved. Then the shorter officer sighed, clearly realizing this wasn't going to be the quick operation they'd hoped for. This isn't over, he said, gesturing for his partner to follow him. You've made things harder for yourself, Mercer. Elias watched them retreat to their transport, his posture relaxed, but his eyes cold. As the vehicle sped off, he closed the door and turned to Serena. You really know how to make friends, he said, his tone light despite the gravity of the situation. She gave him a small, wry smile. I could say the same about you. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the confrontation settling between them. Finally, Serena spoke, her voice quieter than usual. You didn't have to defend. Me, she said, her gaze fixed on the floor. Elias leaned back in his chair, studying her. Sure I did. You're my guest, and more importantly, you're my friend. The words seemed to catch her off guard, her eyes snapping up to meet his. Friend? Yeah, Elias said with a shrug, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Is that such a strange concept? In my world, friendships are complicated, she admitted. Trust is rare, and loyalty even rarer. Well, here's a tip, Elias said, leaning forward. In my world, when someone's got your back, you don't question it. You just accept it. Her lips curved into a faint smile, the vulnerability in her expression giving way to a quiet resolve. Then I'll accept it, and I'll have your back too. Glad to hear it, Elias said, standing up and stretching. Now, let's figure out what we're going to do about those two jokers from this morning. Something tells me they're not the type to give up easily. Serena nodded, her determination mirrored in the set of her jaw. I'm not running, she said firmly. If they want a fight, they'll get one. Elias grinned, his admiration for her growing by the second. That's the spirit, Princess. She rolled her eyes but didn't correct him this time. Together, they began to prepare, their bond strengthened by the challenges ahead. Whatever was coming, they would face it side by side. The preparation turned into something of a marathon. Elias's workshop was small, but well-stocked, a testament to his years of scavenging and tinkering. Serena, to her credit, was a quick study, her initial clumsiness giving way to an unexpected aptitude for problem-solving. You're telling me this thing shoots plasma bolts? She asked, holding up a battered rifle with a skeptical expression. Barely, Elias said, grabbing it and inspecting the power pack. It's old tech, but it should still work in a pinch. Besides, it's not the weapon, it's the person holding it. She raised a brow. Let me guess, some kind of human. Warrior wisdom? He smirked. Something like that. Their banter filled the hours as they fortified the workshop. Elias rigged motion sensors along the perimeter, their signals tied to a jury-rigged console inside. Serena, meanwhile, helped create barricades, her strength surprising Elias as she hefted metal beams into place with relative ease. Remind me not to arm wrestle you, he joked, wiping sweat from his brow. She gave him a playful shove. Remind me not to let you teach me human humor. It's terrible. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the workshop resembled a makeshift fortress. Elias leaned against a stack of crates, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. Serena stood nearby, her hands on her hips as she surveyed their work. "Not bad for a day's effort," she said. Elias nodded. "Let's just hope it's enough." The night passed uneventfully, but the morning brought an unwelcome surprise. The hum of approaching engines pulled Elias from his restless sleep, and he rushed to the console, Serena close behind him. "They're back," he muttered, watching as 3 transports appeared on the screen, flanking a larger, more imposing vehicle. "And they brought friends," Serena added, her tone grim. The transports came to a stop just outside the workshop, their doors hissing open to reveal armed soldiers. At their center stood a woman clad in a sleek uniform, her presence radiating authority. Her sharp eyes locked on the workshop, and she raised a hand, signaling her troops to hold position. "Well, this is cozy," Elias muttered, grabbing a comm device and switching it on. "What do you want?" The woman's voice crackled through the speaker. "Elias Mercer, you are harboring a criminal of the Arctaran Empire. Surrender her, and we'll leave you unharmed." Elias exchanged a glance with Serena, who shook her head. "Not happening," he said into the comm. The woman's expression hardened. "Then you leave us no choice." As the soldiers advanced, Elias and Serena sprang into action. The sensors triggered, setting off a series of traps Elias had rigged, smoke bombs, tripwires, and electrified barriers that slowed the soldiers' progress. Serena took position by a window, the plasma rifle steady in her hands. "Don't fire unless you have to," Elias warned, adjusting the settings on a makeshift pulse cannon he'd assembled. "We're trying to scare them off, not start a war." "Understood," Serena said, though her grip on the rifle tightened. The first wave of soldiers reached the workshop's barricades, their weapons cutting through the smoke. Elias activated the pulse cannon, sending out a blast of energy that knocked several of them off their feet. "Nice shot," Serena said, her admiration genuine. "Thanks," Elias replied, recharging the cannon. "But they're not backing down." As the fight escalated, Serena's precision and courage shone. She covered Elias as he moved between positions, her calm demeanor under fire a stark contrast to the chaos outside. When the larger vehicle began to advance, Elias cursed under his breath. "That's an armored carrier. Our traps won't stop it." Serena's gaze narrowed. "Then we'll have to get creative." She grabbed a small device from Elias's workbench, a thermal detonator he'd been tinkering with, and turned to him. "How does this work?" His eyes widened. "Are you insane? That thing isn't stable." "Neither is our situation," she shot back, her tone leaving no room for argument. Elias hesitated, then nodded. "Press the button on top, throw it, and pray it doesn't explode in your hand." Serena smirked. "Praying isn't really my style." With a swift motion, she armed the device and hurled it toward the advancing carrier. The detonator struck the vehicle's front, releasing a wave of heat and light that forced the soldiers to retreat. As the dust settled, the comm crackled again. "You've made your point," the woman's voice said, tinged with frustration. "But this isn't over." The vehicles withdrew, leaving the workshop battered but intact. Elias and Serena slumped against the wall, their exhaustion evident. "You're insane," Elias said, his voice half laugh, half accusation. "And you're welcome," Serena replied, her grin triumphant. Despite the danger, Elias found himself smiling. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't trade this partnership for anything. The calm after the battle felt eerie, like the silence was holding its breath. Elias sat at his workbench, tinkering with a piece of scrap metal that didn't need fixing, his mind racing through contingencies. Across the room, Serena paced, her movements sharp and restless. "We bought ourselves some time," Elias said, finally, breaking the tension. Serena stopped mid-step, her gaze snapping to him. Time for what? They'll come back, and next time they won't just retreat. Elias leaned back, tossing the metal onto the cluttered bench. We'll figure it out. We always do. We? She crossed her arms, her expression both skeptical and amused. He met her gaze, his smirk disarming. You think I'm letting you face this alone? Not a chance, princess. A flicker of something softened her features, but it was gone in an instant. I told you not to call me that. And yet, here we are, Elias said, his grin widening. Before she could retort, the perimeter sensors buzzed. Serena's hand went to the plasma rifle, and Elias darted to the console. It's just one, he said, frowning at the screen. No transports, no soldiers. Serena moved to the window, peering out. I don't like this. It could be a trap. Could be, Elias admitted, grabbing his sidearm. But if they wanted to ambush us, they'd send more than one person. The figure outside stepped into view, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. They were cloaked, their face obscured, but their posture seemed more hesitant than hostile. Elias exchanged a glance with Serena. Stay here. Cover me. She didn't argue, taking position near the door as Elias stepped outside. The figure remained still, their hands visibly empty. Elias Mercer, they said, their voice distorted by a translator. I come in peace. That's what they all say, Elias replied, keeping his weapon trained on them. Who are you, and what do you want? The figure hesitated, then reached up to lower their hood, revealing a young alien with features that resembled Serena's species. Their skin was a darker hue, and their eyes shone with nervous energy. My name is Callan, they said. I'm here to help. Elias frowned. Help? With what? Protecting her, Callan said, glancing toward the workshop. The princess. Serena stepped outside then, her expression a mixture of suspicion and surprise. Callan? The young alien's gaze lit up. Your Highness, I wasn't sure. You'd remember me. Serena's brow furrowed. You were one of the Palisades, weren't you? I thought... Her voice trailed off, the unspoken word hanging heavily between them. Dead? Callan finished for her, their smile tinged with sadness. I was lucky. I escaped during the siege and found others who were loyal to the crown. Elias holstered his weapon, sensing no immediate threat. All right, let's say, I believe you. Why come here now? Because the Empire is relentless, Callan said, their tone urgent. They'll stop at nothing to capture her. But there's hope. We've been gathering resources, allies. We want to help you fight back. Serena looked skeptical. Fight back? The Empire crushed entire fleets. What could you possibly have that they fear? Callan's gaze shifted to Elias. Him. Elias blinked, caught off guard. Me? I think you've got the wrong guy. No, Callan said firmly. You're the human who saved her, the one who defied the Empire when no one else would. Your name has spread among the resistance. You're a symbol of hope. Elias laughed, the sound bitter. I'm just a guy trying to survive. And yet you've done more than most, Callan countered. The people need someone to believe in, and right now that's you. Serena's eyes narrowed. This isn't about Elias. If you're here to turn him into some kind of figurehead, you can leave. It's not just about him, Callan said quickly. It's about you too. Together, you're stronger than you realize. Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. This is getting ridiculous. Look, if you want to help, great. But don't put me on some pedestal. I'm just doing what anyone... The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Callan stepped forward, their expression earnest. Please, Your Highness, they said. Let us help. You don't have to do this alone. Serena's jaw tightened, her inner conflict evident. Finally, she nodded. All right, but no grand speeches, no martyrdom. We fight smart, not desperate. Callan's relief was palpable. Thank you. Elias clapped his hands together, breaking the tension. Well, if we're doing this, we'd better get started. Kalen, you'd better have more than just words to offer. Callan grinned, pulling a small device from their cloak. I brought something that might interest you. As the device activated, projecting a hologram of detailed schematics, Elias's eyes widened in recognition. That's an Empire command ship, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Kalen nodded. We have a plan to take it down, and with your help, we might just succeed. Serena looked at Elias, her expression a mix of determination and apprehension. What do you think? Elias smiled faintly, his adrenaline surging. I think it's about time we went on the offensive. The hologram cast a pale blue glow across the workshop, illuminating the intricate details of the Empire's command ship. Elias leaned over the projection, his mind racing as he studied the schematics. This is insane, he muttered, tracing a finger along the highlighted weak points. Even if we get past their defenses, the chances of surviving an assault are slim to none. Isn't that what you humans call a calculated risk? Serena asked, leaning beside him, her voice laced with dry humor. Calculated? Sure, but sane? Absolutely not, Elias replied, glancing up at her. Callan stepped forward, their expression earnest. We wouldn't bring this to you if we didn't think it could work. The ship is vulnerable during its resupply runs. If we time it right, we can slip in, disable its systems, and deal a major blow to the Empire. Elias leaned back, folding his arms. And by deal a major blow, you mean blow it to pieces? Kalen hesitated. Not exactly. The Resistance needs the ship intact, its tech, its data. They could turn the tide of this war. Serena raised a brow. You expect us to infiltrate a fully armed command ship, disable it, and what? Hand it over with a bow? Callan held their ground. If anyone can pull it off, it's you two. Elias exchanged a look with Serena, the weight of the decision pressing down on both of them. Finally, he sighed. We're going to need a plan. A good one. Hours turned into a blur as they worked, mapping out every detail of the operation. Kalen provided intelligence on patrol routes and guard rotations, while Elias modified their equipment for the mission. Serena, ever the pragmatist, tested each piece of gear to ensure it wouldn't fail when they needed it most. At one point, as they calibrated the ship's cloaking system, Elias couldn't help but chuckle. What's so funny? Serena asked, her tone suspicious. Just thinking about how I got roped into this, he said. 1 minute, I'm a guy running a salvage shop. The next, I'm plotting to take down an Empire command ship with an alien princess. She smirked. Admit it, you'd be bored otherwise. Fair point, he conceded, his grin widening. By the time their preparations were complete, the plan was as solid as it was ever going to be. The trio stood before Elias's ship, a patched-together freighter that had seen better days, its engines humming softly. This is it, Callan said, their voice steady despite the tension in the air. Elias looked at Serena, his expression serious. You ready for this? She met his gaze, her resolve unshakable. Let's make them regret underestimating us. The journey to the resupply point was tense, the ship's cloaking system straining under the proximity of enemy scanners. Inside the cockpit, the air was thick with anticipation. Approaching target, Elias said, his hands steady on the wire controls. Cloaking fields holding, but we're not invisible forever. Serena leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the massive command ship that loomed ahead. Are we really doing this? Elias smirked. Too late to back out now. The freighter slipped into a maintenance bay, the crew inside too distracted by routine procedures to notice the intruders. Once docked, the trio moved quickly, blending in with the shadows as they navigated the labyrinthine corridors. Elias led the way, his salvager instincts kicking in as he spotted potential hazards and improvised solutions on the fly. Serena covered, Their rear, her plasma rifle at the ready, while Callan guided them through the schematics displayed on their handheld device. "Left here," Callan whispered, pointing toward a junction. "The main power core is just ahead." The group reached the core, a massive structure pulsing with energy. Elias immediately got to work, his hands a blur as he bypassed security protocols and rigged the core for shutdown. "How long?" Serena asked, her voice low but urgent. 10 minutes, if nothing goes wrong," Elias replied, sweat beading on his brow. "Something always goes wrong," Serena muttered, her grip tightening on her weapon. Her words proved prophetic as alarms blared to life, the corridor flooding with red light. Kalen's eyes widened. "They've found us!" Elias cursed under his breath. "Stall them! I need more time!" Serena nodded, stepping into the hallway as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. She took cover behind a support beam, her rifle aimed at the corner. The first wave of soldiers rounded the bend, their weapons raised. Serena fired, her shots precise and unrelenting. The confined space amplified the sounds of the firefight, each blast a deafening roar. Elias worked furiously, his focus unwavering, despite the chaos around him. "Almost there," he muttered, the core's systems bending to his will. Kalen, armed with a smaller sidearm, provided backup for Serena, their aim surprisingly steady. 2 more minutes," Elias shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. Serena gritted her teeth, her movements calculated and efficient as she held the line. "You'd better not be lying, Mercer." With a final surge of effort, Elias finished the override, the core's hum fading into silence. "Got it. Let's move." The trio retreated, the soldiers regrouping as the command ship's systems began to fail. Alarms blared anew, this time signaling a total systems shutdown. Elias led them back to the freighter, his adrenaline spiking as they encountered more resistance. Serena and Callan covered him, their coordinated efforts a testament to the trust they'd built in such a short time. They reached the ship just as enemy reinforcements poured into the bay. Elias fired up the engines, the freighter lifting off as Serena and Callan provided covering fire. As the ship broke free of the command vessel, a massive explosion rocked the freighter, sending it spinning. "What the hell was that?" Elias shouted, wrestling with the controls. Callan checked the sensors, their expression grim. "They triggered a failsafe. The whole ship's going to blow." Elias gritted his teeth, pushing the engines to their limit. "Hold on!" The freighter barely escaped the blast radius, the shockwave sending it tumbling into space. Inside the cockpit, the trio collapsed into their seats, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "That was too close," Serena said, her voice shaky but alive with adrenaline. Elias glanced at her, his grin returning despite the chaos. "Just another day at the office," Callan laughed, the sound a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You humans are insane." "Welcome to the club," Serena replied, her smile genuine for the first time in what felt like forever. As they drifted into the safety of open space, Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. They'd done the impossible, and somehow they'd done it together. The freighter coasted into the orbit of a small, unassuming moon, the debris of the destroyed command ship still glittering faintly in the distance. Inside, the tension began to dissolve, replaced by a heavy, almost surreal silence. Elias powered down the engines, leaning back in his seat with a long exhale. "All right," he muttered, breaking the quiet. "We're alive. That's a win." Callan shot him an incredulous look. A win. That felt more like a near-death experience with bonus fireworks. Serena smirked, standing and stretching her arms. "I don't know, I think he's got a point. We did just pull off one of the boldest heists in galactic history. I'm counting it as a win." Elias chuckled, though his exhaustion was evident. "See? Serena gets it. You've got to celebrate the small victories." As the adrenaline ebbed, reality began to set in. Serena walked over to the viewport, her gaze fixed on the distant stars. Her expression grew serious, the weight of their actions settling over her like a heavy cloak. Elias noticed the shift in her demeanor. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. She didn't turn to him right away, her fingers brushing against the glass. "We just took out a command." "Ship, do you realize what that means? That the Empire's going to be furious?" Elias replied, his attempt at levity falling flat. "It means we've just painted a massive target on our backs," Serena said, finally looking at him. Her eyes held a mixture of fear and determination. "They'll come after us with everything they've got." Elias nodded, his expression growing serious. "Yeah, they probably will. But you know what?" He stood and moved to join her, his tone resolute. "Let them come. If they want a fight, we'll give them one." For a moment, Serena simply stared at him, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. A real, genuine smile that lit up her face in a way he hadn't seen before. "You're either the bravest or the stupidest human I've ever met," she said, shaking her head. "Probably both," Elias replied with a grin. Their moment was interrupted by Callan clearing their throat. "Hate to break up the bonding session, but we've got a bigger problem." Elias turned to face them. "What now?" Callan held up their handheld device, which displayed a rapidly blinking icon. That explosion wasn't just a failsafe. It triggered a distress signal. "The Empire knows exactly what happened, and they're already mobilizing." "Great," Elias muttered, running a hand through his hair. "So much for celebrating." Serena's expression hardened. "Then we need to move. Find somewhere." "To lay low and regroup." Callan hesitated. "There's one place that might work, but it's risky." "Riskier than staying here?" Elias asked, his tone sharp. "Fair point," Callan admitted. They brought up a map highlighting a desolate asteroid field on the edge of the system. "There's a resistance outpost hidden here. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." Elias studied the map, his jaw tightening. "All right, set the coordinates. Let's hope your resistance friends are in a welcoming mood." The journey to the asteroid field was fraught with tension. The freighter's scanners picked up faint traces of Imperial ships combing the area, forcing Elias to take an indirect route to avoid detection. Inside the cockpit, the silence was broken only by the occasional beep of the ship's instruments. Serena sat beside Elias, her arms crossed as she stared out at the void. "You're quiet," Elias said, glancing at her. "Just thinking," she replied, her voice distant. "About?" "Everything," she admitted. "The Empire, the Resistance, you." Elias raised a brow. "Me?" She turned to him, her gaze piercing. "You risked everything to help me. Why?" He hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're a strange one, Mercer." "Coming from you, I'll take that as a compliment," he said with a small smile. Their conversation was cut short as the freighter entered the asteroid field. The ship's sensors lit up, detecting the faint energy signatures of the resistance outpost. "There it is," Callan said, pointing to a cluster of rocks that looked indistinguishable from the rest. Elias guided the ship toward the coordinates, his grip on the controls tightening as they navigated the treacherous terrain. Finally, they reached a small docking bay concealed within the largest asteroid. As the freighter settled onto the landing pad, the group exchanged wary glances. "All right," Elias said, standing. "Let's go make some friends." The outpost was a stark contrast to the sterile corridors of the Empire's ships. It was rough, cobbled together from salvaged materials and filled with a diverse group of aliens and humans who eyed the newcomers with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. A tall, grizzled man stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Who are you? And why shouldn't I throw you out the airlock?" Elias stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "Name's Elias Mercer. This is Serena and Cullen. We just took out an Imperial command ship, and we need your help." The man's eyes narrowed. "Big claim. Got any proof?" Elias gestured to the handheld device Callan was holding. "We've got the data to back it up. And if that's not enough, you're welcome to check the wreckage yourself." The man studied them for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right, let's talk." As they followed him deeper into the outpost, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they might just stand a chance. The outpost was a hive of activity, the hum of machinery and muffled conversations blending with the occasional clink of tools. Elias followed the tall man, who had introduced himself as Rax, through a narrow, dimly lit hallway. As they walked, Serena's hand subtly brushed his as she passed him, her touch sending a brief jolt of electricity through him. He glanced at her, but she was already walking ahead, her expression unreadable. They entered a small, functional briefing room at the heart of the outpost. Rax gestured for them to sit at a cluttered table covered with holographic maps and schematics. "So, you took down a command ship, huh?" Rax said, his voice gravelly but laced with curiosity. Elias sat, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, and now we're hoping you can help us disappear for a while. We've made a lot of enemies." Rax crossed his arms, eyeing them all. "Well, that's no surprise. You've just become the galaxy's most wanted, but I'm not in the business of charity." "We didn't come here to beg," Serena replied. "We're not asking for handouts." Rax looked from her to Elias, then back again. "All right, what exactly do you need?" Elias leaned forward, the plan forming in his mind. "We need weapons. We need to get in contact with your contacts in the Resistance, and we need a way to disappear off the Empire's radar." Rax nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to the holographic map as though considering his options. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that. But getting in touch with the Resistance will take time, and disappearing, well, that's easier said than done. The Empire has eyes everywhere." Callan, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. "We have something the Empire wants. If we can use it to leverage their attention elsewhere, it buys us time to regroup. We can't outrun them forever. We need to turn the tide." Rax studied them, his lips curling into a faint, skeptical smile. "You're all talking about fighting. A war. You sure you're ready for that?" Serena's eyes hardened. "We don't have a choice. The Empire won't stop until we're all dead. But you," she gestured around the room, "you've been fighting longer than we have. If you want to make a difference, this is your chance." Rax's expression softened ever so slightly. "All right," he said after a beat. "I'll set up a secure line to the Resistance, but you'll have to lay low for now. We can give you cover, but don't expect much beyond that." "That's all we need," Elias said, his tone determined. "Just enough time to get our hands on something useful." As they discussed the finer details of their next move, Elias found his thoughts drifting back to Serena. She was still, standing across the room, her posture stiff but resolute. He couldn't shake the feeling that her wariness wasn't just directed at the mission. When their conversation concluded, Serena approached him, her gaze serious. "You really think we can win this, don't you?" Elias met her eyes, his voice steady. "I don't know if we'll win, but I do know this. We can make a difference. And that's enough for me." She nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. Then, in a softer tone, she added, You're not as reckless as I thought. He smirked. You're not so cynical either. Serena's lips quirked up in the briefest of smiles. I've been fighting for too long to believe in easy victories. Elias leaned against the table, watching her carefully. Maybe it's not about easy victories. Maybe it's about finding the strength to fight when everything else is falling apart. For a moment, the room fell into silence. Then Serena shook her head, a soft chuckle escaping her lips. God, you really are a weird one, Mercer. I'll take that as a compliment, he said, his grin widening. She rolled her eyes, but there was something in her expression that softened. Something less guarded. Don't get too cocky. We're not done yet. Elias nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of warmth at her words. They were in this together now, and somehow that made all the difference. Rax returned shortly, handing them a small device. This'll get you in touch with the resistance. It's encrypted. Don't waste it. Elias took the device, tucking it into his jacket pocket. Thanks. Rax's eyes flicked to Serena. I'll get the supplies together. You've got enough enemies as it is. Understood, Serena replied, her voice clipped. With that, Rax left them alone, and Elias felt the weight of what lay ahead. He was starting to realize just how far they had come in such a short time. The stakes were higher than ever, but the more he saw of Serena, her strength, her resolve, the more he felt they had a shot at succeeding. They had a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Elias was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win this war. As they prepared to leave the outpost, Elias caught Serena looking out the viewport again, her expression distant. He approached her quietly. Ready for the next step? He asked softly. She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing as if considering his question. Then, with a faint smile, she nodded. Let's get to work. Together, they stepped out into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next. The freighter was quieter than usual as Elias navigated the narrow, winding paths of the asteroid belt. The tension from their earlier conversation had settled into something less frantic, but it still hung in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Serena was at the back of the ship, tinkering with the systems to ensure they wouldn't be detected when they finally reached the rendezvous point with the resistance. Kalen was in the cockpit with him, quiet as usual, but no less focused. We're getting close, Elias muttered, his eyes scanning the navigation system. Kalen didn't respond immediately. They were a bit more detached these days. It was clear that the cost of their involvement with after everything they'd been through, it was hard not to feel the pressure mounting. Yeah, I can see it, Kalen finally said, tapping a few buttons on the console. Just a few more miles. Elias nodded, keeping his gaze fixed ahead. They were all in this together now, for better or worse. The stakes had shifted from survival to something far more dangerous, an all-out war with the Empire, a war that might very well cost them everything. Serena walked into the cockpit, her hands wiping off the grease from the maintenance work. We good to go? She asked, her tone casual but her eyes alert. We'll be in position shortly, Elias replied, his gaze still fixed on the map. The comm system beeped suddenly, startling them all. Captain Mercer? A voice crackled through the static. Elias straightened, his eyes narrowing. This is Mercer. Who's this? This is Commander Vera, the voice responded. We're receiving your signal. Prepare for landing. We'll take you from here. Elias exhaled, slowly giving a nod to Kalen. This is it. A moment later, the ship shook as it broke through the dense asteroid field, the large expanse of space opening up to reveal a hidden rebel base built into the side of a massive asteroid. It looked like a ghost town at first, quiet and untouched. But as they got closer, the unmistakable signs of life appeared. A few ships docked at the outskirts, armed guards patrolling, and faint lights flickering in the distance. Safe to land? Serena asked, her voice steady but still betraying a hint of tension. "For now," Elias said, guiding the ship toward the designated landing pad. He could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. Everything they had fought for, everything they had risked, was riding on this. The freighter came to a smooth landing, and the crew filed out, following Vera and a small team of rebels who quickly ushered them toward the base's interior. The atmosphere in the base was unlike anything Elias had experienced before. People working tirelessly on various tasks, the clinking of tools, the low hum of machinery, and a steady sense of urgency in the air. There were no fancy uniforms here, no polished floors, just people with dirt on their hands, fighting for a cause bigger than themselves. "Welcome to our home," Vera said as they moved deeper into the base. "I'll get you set up with supplies and information." Elias could sense the underlying tension in her voice. She was trying to be welcoming, but there was an edge there, an acknowledgement that their arrival had changed things. They were no longer just strangers looking for help. They were valuable assets, and the way Vera and the other rebels eyed them proved that. As they followed Vera through the base, Elias exchanged a quick glance with Serena. Despite the grittiness of the place, there was something almost reassuring about it, like they had finally found a place to stand their ground. Vera stopped in front of a large, heavily reinforced door and gestured for them to follow her inside. It was a meeting room, filled with maps and holographic displays. A few other commanders were already there, including a woman with sharp features and an intense gaze who stood near the table. "Commander Vera," the woman said, nodding briefly. "Mercer, Serena, Kalen, I presume?" "That's us," Elias said, taking a seat at the table. "We've got a lot to discuss." Vera gestured for them to continue. "We've been tracking the Empire's movements for weeks now. They're more aggressive than ever, and our resources are spread thin. You've given us a chance to make a real strike, but we need to know what you're offering in return." Elias sat up straighter. "We've got information. We know the Empire's next move, and we know exactly how to hit them where it hurts." The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to him. Serena leaned forward. "It's not just about hitting them. We can expose them, break their hold on this sector. They'll come after us, but it'll give the resistance the opening they need." The woman with the sharp features considered this for a moment, then nodded. "You've got my attention." Elias held up a hand. "But we'll need your help too. We can't do this alone. We need allies, and we need something that can level the playing field." Vera exchanged a glance with the other commanders, then looked back at them. "We have the resources, but you'll need to prove yourselves first. If you can pull this off, we'll give you everything you need." Serena raised an eyebrow. "What kind of prove yourselves are we talking about?" Vera smiled, but it was a cold smile, one that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. "A test, to make sure you're as capable as you claim." Elias's gut instinct told him to be wary. The resistance wasn't a charity, and they weren't interested in recruits who couldn't pull their weight. But at the same time, this was their best shot. "Fine," Elias said, his voice firm. "We're in." The room seemed to exhale collectively, but it wasn't a sigh of relief. It was a quiet acknowledgement that things were about to get much more complicated. As Vera began outlining the next phase of their mission, Elias caught Serena's eye. There was something about her, something in her gaze that told him she understood the gravity of the situation better than anyone else. This wasn't just another fight. This was everything. "We're really doing this, huh?" he asked quietly. Serena gave him a small smile, her lips curving slightly. "Like you said, Mercer, sometimes it's about finding the strength to fight when everything else is falling apart." Elias smiled back, but his heart was heavy. They were all in this together, and this time there would be no turning back. The final mission had been planned meticulously, and they all knew it was their last shot. As Elias, Serena, and Kalen stood on the command deck of the rebel ship, the weight of the task ahead pressed heavily on them. Their target was a heavily fortified Imperial space station, an asset the Empire would never expect them to attack. But it wasn't just about destroying it. They had a plan to expose the Empire's lies to the galaxy, to show the people the truth they had been hiding for decades. "We do this right, and the Empire's grip on this sector is done," Elias said, his voice low but resolute. Serena was adjusting her blaster, her brow furrowed in concentration. "And if we don't do this right, we're dead. It's as simple as that." Callan, ever the quiet strategist, leaned over the data screen. "We have one chance. We take the station, broadcast the message, and get the hell out before they send reinforcements." Elias nodded. "We've done impossible things before. This is no different." The ship lurched as they neared the station, the final countdown ticking away. The entire crew was in position, but there was an underlying tension. No one was sure whether they would survive this. "I've got your back," Serena said suddenly, her voice quieter than usual. She didn't look at him as she said it, but Elias could feel the weight of the words. He met her eyes, a quiet understanding passing between them. "We're in this together." The ship docked with the space station's outer ring, and the crew quickly moved into position. They encountered minimal resistance at first, but the further they got into the heart of the station, the more intense the opposition became. Soldiers, security drones, and automated defenses were everywhere. Elias and Serena moved like a well-oiled machine, their years of fighting side by side evident in their seamless coordination. Callan, on the other hand, was in the shadows, quietly, deactivating security systems and leaving a trail of chaos in their wake. But just as they were about to reach the communications hub, the unthinkable happened. A familiar voice crackled over the comms. "This is Admiral Torque of the Imperial fleet," the voice boomed, cold and unyielding. "You've made a grave mistake, rebels. The Empire will destroy you. You're already dead." Elias gritted his teeth. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same admiral who had led the hunt for them for years. The same man who had nearly killed Serena and Elias during their escape from the Empire's clutches. "We'll see about that, Torque," Elias muttered under his breath. "Keep moving," Serena urged, her hand gripping his arm. They didn't have time to fight. Not now. Not when the entire mission was on the line. As they reached the communications hub, they began the process of hacking into the station's mainframe. But just as they were about to initiate the broadcast, alarms blared throughout the station, signaling that the Empire was on high alert. "We've got company!" Callan shouted, his voice strained. "We don't have time for a fight!" Serena snapped. "We're doing this now!" With a flurry of activity, they initiated the broadcast. The entire galaxy would soon hear the truth. The Empire's secrets would no longer stay buried. The comms crackled to life again. This time, it was Admiral Torque, his voice seething with fury. "You think you've won? You're nothing. The Empire is eternal." Elias looked up at Serena, their eyes locking in a moment of shared understanding. This wasn't about victory or defeat anymore. It was about standing up for something bigger than themselves. "Let's finish this," Elias said, and with that, they made their final escape. The broadcast was sent. The Empire's lies were exposed to the galaxy. As they boarded the ship and made their way back to the rebel base, the adrenaline began to fade, and a strange sense of finality washed over them. They had done it. They had turned the tide. The Empire would come for them, of course. They would send everything they had to stop them. But for the first time in a long time, Elias felt hope, real hope, for the future. "You did it," Serena said quietly, standing next to him as they watched the station explode in the distance. "We did it," Elias replied, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the mission, of everything they had sacrificed, hung in the air. And then, just as the final blast of the station's destruction echoed through the space around them, Serena turned to Elias with a smile that was equal parts fierce and tender. "Guess we're not so bad at this whole saving the galaxy thing after all." Elias chuckled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Yeah, not bad at all. And as they flew off into the vast unknown, the future was no longer a question of survival. It was a question of how they would shape it, together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting sci-fi adventures.